count. So if you'll raise your hand if you're a daily Bible reader, he'll get you counted. And Barry has some books. So if you don't have a book, if you'll raise your hand, he'll get you one of those. Mike and Barry are a well-oiled machine this morning. Johnny, would you mind leading us in prayer this morning?
Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the blessings that you give us every day of our lives, and we thank you especially for this chance to come and to study from your word. Please be with Chris and the other teachers this morning. Help them have a good remembrance of the things they've prepared to say. Please be with us as students. Help us to listen carefully, put into our lives things that we learn here. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Johnny. And again, thanks to each of you for being here this morning. There's a saying, and you've probably heard it, that any fool can complain about something, and most fools do. Complaining is, to a lot of us, like a sport. We practice at it. We get really good at it. We almost perfect our skills at complaining. And unfortunately, complaining is not only contagious. You probably notice that when you It's also one of those things, probably like a lot of sin, that we can see more clearly in others than we do in ourselves. We notice people who complain, and typically we try to avoid people that complain a lot because they bring us down. And like I said, we find that we're more likely to complain ourselves a lot when we're constantly around people who all they seem to want to do is to complain. And this morning, as we continue our study in the book of Exodus, we're going to study Israel complaining. And it's sort of ironic. Back in our first lesson, I had that lesson, and we studied Israel and Egypt. I didn't know that I was going to have this particular lesson, but I made the comment that at some point, as we study Exodus, we're going to study the ingratitude and the complaining of Israel. And I wanted us, when we did that, to think back to that first lesson. Bitter because of their bondage in Egypt, the making of bricks and the just being captive to another people and having to be servants to another people. It was really bad times, and it got worse, remember, as we continued our study when Moses first went to Pharaoh and asked that he allow the Israelites to go and worship. Well, what was Pharaoh's response? Yeah, he made it even harder for Israel because to him, to Pharaoh, it was almost as if, well, you people have enough time on your hands that you want to go worship God. Well, you've got enough time that you can go get your own straw rather than us providing it. And oh, by the way, we expect you to do the same amount of work as you were doing before. So it started off as being very difficult for Israel and Egypt. And as we've continued to study, it got even worse. And God delivering them from Egypt and beginning this journey towards Canaan. And if you were to think, if you didn't know anything about the timeline of how long it took for Israel to start complaining about their condition as they left Egypt, if you didn't know how long it was, what would be your instinct to say, okay, how long was it did it probably take them before they started to murmur against Moses and Aaron? How long did it probably take them before they started to complain against God? In my mind, I would think, if I didn't know better, I would think, well, surely it was at least a generation or two. I mean, surely at least the generation of people that were in Egypt that saw the signs from God. Surely that generation had to die off, the generation that passed through the Red Sea. They started to murmur against God. Well, that's not the case. 3 days. 3 days is how long it took them once they crossed the Red Sea before they started complaining. And you can read about that in chapter 15. In verse 22, it says, "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And they began to complain to Moses because they didn't have any water to drink." Now, on the one hand, you would say, well, not having water is maybe something to complain about. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. You have to have water to live. But just 3 days earlier, these people had seen God do this miraculous parting of the Red Sea, and they had crossed out of Egypt. They would understand the power of God. And it's almost as if Israel was somehow under the impression that this journey was going to be easy. And that once they got out of Egypt, the hard part was over. And now it was going to be smooth sailing, and they were going to go right to Canaan and have everything that God had always promised them. It's interesting that God did not send them the most direct route from Egypt to Canaan. As you read in chapter 13, he actually sent them around the area. Instead of going through the direct route, they would have had to cross through the Philistine territory. And the reason he didn't send them through the Philistines is he thought that when they saw or had to face war going through the Philistines, that they would turn around and go back, because God realized really how weak is leading these Israelites. How many Israelites do you picture in your mind? How big is the group? I mean, this is an actual question. I mean, maybe not a specific number, but is it hundreds? Is it thousands?
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands? Sure. I think of, when I think of tens of thousands, I think of football stadiums. So Neyland Stadium has not been full in a long time. But when it is full, it holds 102,455 people in the stands. And that's a big group in my mind. And that would be a lot of people to try to lead somewhere. But the book of Numbers tells us that it's a lot more than even that. Numbers in chapter 1 describes the number of able-bodied men over the age of 20. And it says there were 600. You can see that in verse 46 of Numbers chapter 1. So if there were 603,550 able-bodied men over the age of 20, it would stand to reason there were probably that many women. So you double that. There were probably some people who were over 20 who were not able-bodied. There were probably some people who were under the age of 20. So it's easy to kind of do some math and figure there were at least 2 or 3 million people that Moses is about to lead through this wilderness. And those people had to have something to drink, and they had to have something to eat. And, oh, by the way, they're in the desert. They were never going to survive without God. They were always going to have to depend on God. And so they complained. When they didn't have this water, they complained to Moses, and God gave them water in Exodus chapter 15. And in verse 26, His commandments and keep all His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So to this point, as God has given them this water, think of the things that God has done for His people. He delivered them from bondage. He has given them victory over their enemies as He allowed the waters of the Red Sea to kill the Egyptian army that was coming after them. He's given them spiritual leadership through Moses and through Aaron. He has now provided for their physical needs and given them water to drink out in this desert. And now He has made a promise to them that if you continue to be faithful to me, I will continue to take care of you. So He's done those things already for these people. In just a few weeks, probably less than a month, they're going to start complaining again. And that's where our lesson is this morning in Exodus chapter 16. And so let's begin reading our text in Exodus 16, beginning in verse 2. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Now let me stop right there. Those of you that have raised children or are currently raising children, are they ever over dramatic? Maggie Beth, your children would never be over dramatic about anything, would they? My girls sometimes are over dramatic. One of them, though, was this morning when she was wanting a toy before she walked out the house. You grown adults who are being pretty over dramatic. Oh, God, you've brought us out here to die, to kill us with lack of food in the wilderness. Really? I mean, did they really think that God had done that? And this idea that, oh, back when we were in Egypt, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, is probably when they were back in Egypt, we had plenty to eat.
When they were slaves.
When we were slaves, we had all the food we want. I doubt the Egyptians took them to Golden Corral every day after they got done making bricks, and that they just had a feast, everything that they could eat, things were good. But how quickly they forgot how bad things were in Egypt. And here's the thing, it's easy for us to look at them and to criticize them for blaming God, because that's what they were doing. They were essentially blaming God, even though they were taking it out on Moses. But so often we do the same thing. And lashing out at God and not remembering where our blessings come from and really how blessed that we were. And certainly they're being over dramatic and just showing a lack of gratitude and a lack of a remembrance of just a few weeks ago we were slaves. And the truth is they probably didn't have all that they wanted to eat. They certainly were not free, didn't have freedom to do as they pleased. And the idea that God would bring them out into the wilderness just to let them die was preposterous. Let's continue reading in verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, "At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, and in the morning bread to the full, for the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses spoke to Aaron, "Say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints, Now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is talking about Israel. And he's and he mentions sins like lust, idolatry, sexual immorality, and he also mentions complaining. And for us, probably complaining wouldn't necessarily be on the same scale, because we like to classify sins as how bad they are and think that some sins are a lot worse than others. But Paul puts complaining right in the same category as something like sexual immorality. Now you ask your spouse, which is worse, complaining or sexual immorality, and they're going to say, well, sexual immorality is a lot worse. But Paul says, don't complain. He told the Philippians in Philippians chapter 2, do all things without complaining and disputing. And when we read our text about Israel, were complaining. They were all complaining. And to me, their complaining showed one or two things, or maybe both. A lack of faith in God and a lack of appreciation for God. Now, they had to have known, to me, they had to have known that God was capable of providing them with food. I mean, 2 or 3 weeks earlier, he had given them water where there was no water. So you would think surely they had faith, enough faith to believe that he could do it. But I'm not sure, and it doesn't seem like they believed that he would do it. So they didn't really have faith that he was willing to keep the promise that he had made. Remember the promise back in chapter 15? He said, if you continue to serve me, I'm going to take care of you, and I'm paraphrasing. It didn't take them very long to either forget that or to play here was a lack of gratitude. I think complaining and ingratitude go hand in hand. If Israel had truly been grateful for being delivered from slavery, if they had truly been grateful that God had brought them out, and that had been their primary focus, is how grateful they were, they wouldn't have had time to complain. Now they could have approached God and said, we're hungry, and we know you can provide in a different manner, right? And I think that's sometimes where we mess up is we complain rather than ask. You remember Paul? He had that thorn in the flesh, and he besought the Lord. In other words, he asked the Lord 3 times to remove that thorn in the flesh. And then when God said, my grace is sufficient for thee, this thorn in the flesh. He went on about his life and doing what he was supposed to do. There's a cartoon that probably some of you have seen, and in this cartoon there's 4 different boxes in the cartoon, and in the first box there's this old car parked at a red light next to this new car. And the guy driving the old car has some of those thought bubbles coming up from his head saying, man, I wish I had a new car like the one that was next to him. And in the second box, there's somebody on a bicycle driving down the sidewalk looking at the old car that's parked at the red light. And the thought bubble from his head is, I wish I had a car to be able to drive around, as he looked at that old car. And in the third box, there was somebody walking down the sidewalk, and they're walking towards that person who's driving the bicycle. And their thought is, it'd be nice to have a bicycle to ride around where I didn't have to walk. And in the last box, there's somebody up on the balcony. About perspective, right? Each one of those people in that little cartoon had a different perspective, and they were all focused on what they didn't have, what somebody else had that they wanted that they didn't have, rather than being grateful for the health to walk, the ability to get out and ride a bicycle. They focused on what they didn't have. To me, that's one of the things about social media that can be dangerous, is we're looking at somebody else's highlight reel, and their highlight reel on social media looks a lot better than our highlight reel, right? Their vacation looked a lot more fun than our vacation. Their job or whatever great things that they're having that they posted on Instagram or Facebook or whatever looks a lot better than what I have. Because that's what people do. They post the good stuff. Most people don't post the waking up with a kid throwing up at 2 a.m. or some of the other bad things and the struggle. Be grateful for what we have. And I think that can lead to complaining. So I think complaining and ingratitude go hand in hand. Any comments? I've done all the talking, so comments so far? Despite God's continual blessings, His continual provisions for Israel, they questioned His either ability or willingness to provide for them, to feed them. And it's easy for us, again, to judge Israel and wonder how they could have missed the goodness and faithfulness of God. But we can be just as guilty as they were. And we look at Israel and we hear them say, oh, we would have been better off in Egypt as slaves than for you to bring us out into the wilderness to die. And we look at them and say, how could you be so blind? But I wonder, I mean, at least they were complaining about something that was a life or death situation. You think about some of the things that we complain about, and boy, it seems pretty trivial in comparison. But God continues to bless us, continues to provide for our needs, just like He did to Israel. And as you continue through our passage this morning, you read about the promise and the provision. The promise from God that He's going to feed them, He's going to take care of them, and then the provision that ultimately He gave them. And it's interesting to me that He only gave them enough every day to sustain them for that day, except on the day before the Sabbath. He provided 2 days' worth, and they were to go and gather 2 days' worth so they didn't have to go out and work and gather on the Sabbath. But every other day, He only gave them enough to feed them that day. And if they tried to gather more than their fair share, it was ruined. It would get wormy. Every day. Do what or do?
Keep their faith.
To keep their faith. We've already established that Israel didn't have a very good memory. that they forgot pretty quickly how God blessed them. So maybe by having to go out every day and gather something that they had not worked for, something that God had provided them, maybe that would help them remember where those blessings came from.
It's no different than today. The Lord provides, but we have to be willing to do our part.
That's right. That's right. And this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's too far of a stretch. I think that's the reason He wants us to be here every Sunday, because we're forgetful too. And it's not as if God needs me to worship Him. He doesn't need me to worship Him. His ego is not such that He needs our worship. But He knows that if we're not here, Israel was totally dependent on God for their food. Again, they had no chance of surviving. This 2, 3, however many million people it was, they didn't have any chance of surviving without God. Well, we don't have any chance at surviving spiritually without God, which is why it's so important that we're here to remind ourselves and to encourage one another on a regular basis about such things.
And I think we're worse when times are good,
Mm-hmm.
as far as staying away.
Yeah, yeah,
I pray harder when something's going on.
sure, yeah. When 9/11 happened, well, I've used this before, and a lot of y'all have too. When 9/11 happened, church buildings filled up. People were remembering God and how important spiritual things were. And the farther we get from things like that, the easier it is, when times are good, the easier it is to kind of forget God. Was there another comment, Eric?
And try
Yeah.
to sell it. They would mess that up in so
Yeah.
many ways, and we would too.
Mm-hmm.
So it was important for them to understand they need to go out and get their own and not get more, not get less, get the right amount.
Yeah.
And the same applies for us spiritually. It's our responsibility to go take care of those
Yeah.
things.
God provides, but it's not a handout that we don't have to do anything, right? And that was the way it was for Israel. He still expected them to go out and gather, and as he said, if they didn't do what they were supposed to, they either went hungry or they did go hungry. I mean, if you continue reading through this story, if they didn't heed what was said, it bred worms and stank. It ruined. It was no good. Now this manna, what does the word manna mean? This is not necessarily part of the lesson, but if you continue reading the chapter, you find that this manna was pretty important and continued to be pretty important for a long time. But the word really means is this, and so that's what they named it. They named it manna because they didn't know what it was. And that manna would continue to be important, and God would provide that basically for the next 40 years, according to verse 35. And if you read in the book of Joshua, once they entered Canaan, the manna stopped. But for 40 years, as they traveled through the wilderness, they would eat this manna every day. And you think, well, didn't they get tired of eating manna? Yes, they did. And they complained about that too, because that's what Israel did. They complained, and we're no different. We complain about things as well. I like the conclusion, excuse me, that the author has on page 101, so we'll read that as we close. He says, complaints are both contagious and dangerous. Perhaps the easiest thing to do is to see a problem and begin to complain. In Israel's case, in each case, God provided for their needs. Rather than complaining about what we lack, let us thank God for what He provides. Rather than complaining about problems, let us go to work in search of solutions. That last sentence especially is pretty powerful. whether it's at home, at work, in the church. We're probably all guilty of complaining about problems instead of looking and trying to help be a part of the solution. So hope this lesson has been helpful to you. Again, I appreciate the comments, appreciate each of you being here.